Thanks for tuning in to the second episode of Heritage Happy Hour. We're your hosts, Tiffany and
Natalie.
And we are the Heritage Consultants at Blue Willow Heritage. We are based in North Yorkshire and we help clients just like you with listed building consent issues and anything else to do with your historic property. Natalie, what on earth do we do? What is our job?
We are buildings archaeologists and we deal with all forms of built heritage, ranging from buildings, subsurface archaeology, whatever your site requires, we can help.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about retrospective planning and retrospective listed building consent. This is something that you might have come across before, either with your own property or perhaps just in the news. It's something that does come up quite a bit where developers have done something illegally and are then forced by the council to either undo it or rebuild whatever has previously been demolished. So it's definitely a hot topic at the minute.
So what actually is retrospective planning? When you've made a change to your property that requires planning permission or listed building consent that you've not had approved or it was done before you bought the property, a local authority can request that you submit for retrospective planning permission for works that have been carried out, whether you did them or not. Yeah, that'll do.
Failure to apply for planning permission when required can lead to an enforcement notice being served, requiring either a hefty fine or the reversal of the works. Failure to follow an enforcement notice is a criminal offence and could actually result in jail time, which is something that a lot of our listeners might not have dealt with before.
Do we say jail over here?
Oh, do we not say jail?
Is that an American thing?
No, that's jail. Yeah, I don't know. You'd say go to jail, wouldn't you?
I don't think so.
What would you say?
Prison.
But jail and prison are different, aren't they?
Get locked up.
Isn't prison like...
Banged up.
Isn't
Yeah.
prison... Banged up something different in America?
Yeah, that's what my dad says. He's like, oh, they got banged up.
Let's not get banged up. No one's... Failure to follow an enforcement notice is a criminal offence and actually counts as a heritage crime and could potentially result in you serving jail time. I'm going to say jail because, you know what?
You are American, own it.
I'm allowed to say what I want. Planning applications are usually determined by the local planning authority, although sometimes they'll be decided by the Secretary of State. Historic England will be consulted by the authority, making the decision on many applications which could affect designated heritage assets.
So, should your building be listed, any works to alter, extend or demolish the building in any way that affects its character of building as special interest requires listed building consent from the local planning authority, whether it needs planning permission or not. Listed building status covers the entire building, internal and external, and so works which require consent might include the replacement of windows and internal alterations, for example.
Planning applications and listed building consent applications are usually decided by the local planning authority, which is the local district authority in regions with county and district councils, or the unitary authority or London Borough. Local planning authorities should be happy to discuss the requirements of any application in terms of supporting material and the merits of any proposals as part of a pre-application discussion, and this is the same case for retrospective consent. So if you've just purchased a property and find that there have been works undertaken without consent, the best thing to do is approach your local authority as soon as possible and find out what needs to be done to regularise the works.
So, how does retrospective planning differ when seeking it on a heritage asset?
So, if you're applying for retrospective planning permission, you might be wondering whether or not your application will be approved. Recent studies have shown that 1 in 8 applications for retrospective planning permission, around 12%, are turned down, and that can turn out to be an expensive risk. That number rises if the site has heritage complications, as it depends on the scale of the works that were undertaken. So when it comes to retrospective consent, it might require listed building consent in addition to regular planning permission if your property is listed. With that in mind, you might also be wondering whether it's possible to get retrospective consent on a listed building approved. And the short answer is yes, it is obviously possible, but it does depend, as we said previously, on the scale and extent of the works, as well as when they were undertaken, by whom they were undertaken, etc. What the important thing to remember is that even if you have inherited these issues and the previous owner undertook the works, you are still liable for getting these regularised with the council. It's not a case where you can say, I didn't do it and be absolved of it. You've then got to put in the work and time and unfortunately the expense of trying to get it all resolved.
Show willingness, the conservation officer, that you're happy to work on it.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about putting your best foot forward.
Yeah.
We found that the sooner you approach a conservation officer, or whether you do that yourself or via a heritage consultant, they are more willing to work with you to try and get things above board, especially if it's something that was undertaken before you inherited the property. To give you a bit of an idea of how this does work, we've set aside a few examples that we'll talk about a bit later on. So, how can a heritage consultant actually help when it comes to retrospective planning applications?
So firstly, your heritage consultant can actually help you identify what are the illegal works in your property and what aren't, and then they will advise you on how to get everything above board. This will often require them to submit a heritage statement that's tailored to your project, and they will also manage the application, acting as the agent on your behalf. We can also negotiate with local authorities and conservation officers to see what, if any, reversals are going to be required, what mitigation we'll need, what's the likely outcome of this going to be.
Yeah, and it's all about just having a really open conversation with them, especially if it's something that was done before you purchased the property. I think we should also touch a bit on whether it's you that's done the works without consent, because that's something that we come across as well, where potentially people didn't know they needed listed building consent for smaller projects, like attaching a satellite dish or moving a boundary wall and things like that. So it can get a little bit more complicated when it's been undertaken by the current owner, but that doesn't mean that your application will be refused.
So what are the consequences of not seeking planning permission or having retrospective works refused?
For a bog standard planning application that is undertaken before the works have actually started, if they're refused or the council doesn't approve of the plans, a period of mediation and negotiation between the planner and the applicant can allow for suitable alterations to the planning application to be made. This means that plans can evolve and change based on the feedback from the various consultees within the local authority. However, with retrospective planning, it's not quite as straightforward as the works have already been undertaken, so the period of negotiation has kind of passed. So, worst case scenario, let's say that you've undertaken illegal works that require planning permission or listed building consent, and the retrospective application is refused. You can appeal the decision if you have grounds to go on. This could be things such as the mishandling of the application by the council, a lack of objectivity, etc. And should it be the case that you lose on appeal, then you'll likely be left with a hefty fine or ordered to reverse the works, and completely worst case scenario, a prison sentence. Ultimately, undertaking works to a listed building without consent is technically a heritage crime. It's just the scale of that crime that changes based on the level of work that's been done, how it impacts the significance, and also how willing the owner is to bring everything above board with the council. I don't think we can stress enough the importance of getting off on the right foot with the council. It can make all the difference whether or not you get something approved.
Otherwise, I think it can be a bit of a headache.
Yeah.
I know it can be a bit of a
Yeah.
headache. So, yeah, it's just always best to put your best foot forward and show willing, and if they ever pull up you on illegal works, so.
Yeah. It's, worst case scenario at that point, you might get a bit of a slap on the wrist, but trying to keep it a secret or just hope that it won't get caught in conveyancing and things like that. If you are to sell the property, it can really, really hold up a sale.
Although I do appreciate sometimes why some listed building owners will be like, oh, I just want to put a satellite dish on, or I just want to, do this and do minor little things. I completely understand why a normal homeowner can do that. Why can't I do that without listed building consent? It seems ridiculous, but it's the law, unfortunately, and you have to do it. But it's very easy to get stuff like that above board and very quick, if you approach it right from the start.
Yeah, exactly. There are things that obviously are a lot more structural. And I think during lockdown, we found that a lot of clients had a lot of time at home and, ideas about home improvement. And obviously it was a bit difficult to get planning through at the time because the council was very short-staffed. And so we've definitely become aware of a lot of schemes that were undertaken during lockdown that are now requiring to be regularised. It's kind of like the heritage version of a lockdown puppy. It's like, I'll just put this wall in, or I'll just put a new window in. And it's only now that these developments are starting to come to light, or the clients are realising that actually they've been a bit naughty and they should
want,
really
yeah,
get it sorted.
They want to sell their house and no one can buy it. So.
Yeah.
Well, they can buy it, but no one wants to.
Yes. So if you own a listed property, you might be wondering how you can avoid needing to apply for retrospective permission. And the obvious answer is not to do any works that have been unauthorised. But it can be a bit of a fine line trying to figure out what does and what doesn't need consent. It's, again, like we've been talking about, attaching a satellite dish, or we've recently had a question about somebody who wanted to put one of those wireless Ring doorbells on their property, and they were asking whether they needed consent. And the majority of the advice from fellow listed building owners was that they didn't. But in actual fact, if you're doing anything to the physical fabric, whether that's, it's not necessarily putting like a picture up or things like that, but something that's going to physically affect the fabric of the building.
Rewiring, stuff like that.
Yeah. But if you're not entirely sure, the best thing to do is to ask the conservation officer or a heritage consultant. We are aware that it's not always easy to get hold of conservation officers. They are obviously very busy. Some of them work part-time. The council's resources are stretched as it is. So it may be that there's a length of time to get in touch, but that's where people like myself and Natalie come in, where if anybody wants to just send us an email or give us a quick call, and we're going to be happy to run through, what you're thinking of doing and whether or not you would need that particular type of permission. It's one of those forewarned is forearmed situations where the more information you have from the beginning, then you can avoid having to go through these extra hoops later on. So, you might be wondering, what do you have to do if you've just realised you may have undertaken work that requires retrospective permission?
So, firstly, step 1, don't panic.
Yes, that is good
panic.
advice. Never panic.
You'll be absolutely fine. Most of the time, as Tiffany said earlier on, only 12% of applications are refused, and usually they're only refused because the client is maybe particularly stubborn on what they want, or they're not willing to work with the council. If you show willing, if you're more than happy to alter stuff slightly to get stuff through, you'll be absolutely fine. So step 1, don't panic. Step 2, unless you're very well versed on heritage law and how the system works, I would obviously suggest hiring a heritage consultant.
Yes, we're never going to suggest not doing that.
But you can also contact your local authority to see what they advise. Let them know what's happened. Let them know that either admit to it yourself, they'll be quite happy that you've been very honest with them, or say, look, I've inherited a problem that I don't know what to do, I need planning permission on it. And they will obviously guide you on what the steps you need to take are. You will need to submit a retrospective application, whether that be planning permission, listed building, consent, or both together. And that will obviously, in the case of heritage assets, and should the historic environment have the potential to be impacted by the works. If you're unsure about what actually you will need listed building consent for, our previous podcast also talks about this.
Yeah, it kind of goes into a bit more about the frequently asked questions, the sort of myths surrounding listed building ownership and things like that. So I think it'd be useful to kind of run through some examples that we've had personally. Obviously, names and properties have all been stripped for confidentiality reasons. It's a good opportunity to give our listeners an idea of the sorts of projects that we work on. One of these, which was very straightforward, was the conversion of an old coach house. In this case, the owner, who was an elderly gentleman, he unfortunately passed away, and his family was trying to sell the property. It was actually caught at conveyancing that the conversion of the property was undertaken about 30 years ago, but it was done without consent, and the coach house was actually curtilage listed to a larger property.
He was living in this house though, wasn't he?
Yes.
Until he died, so he'd been living there for 30 years and no one had picked up on it, which is...
And it was smack dab in the middle of a conservation area. It was, they had plenty of opportunity to potentially pull up on it.
Yeah.
But they found it out anyway and got in touch with us to see if we could help. So we went down and had a look, and honestly, hands down, it is one of the best conversions I've ever seen. It was done so sympathetically. There was a lovely cart shed entrance that got retained, and they put the doors into it, and it was just so nice.
It still looks, you knew it was an old coach house by looking at it, so...
It kept all the like legibility, and also in terms of new openings, they had put in a new window, but they matched it exactly to like the arched brick headers were the same. It was single glazed. It was timber. It was just like an exemplar conversion. But a conservation officer and the local council had been giving them some trouble when it came to the insulation. So they were a bit worried that when it got converted, that the insulation was going to be damaging the external brickwork.
I think they thought usually insulation is attached to the internal plasterboarding, so it's like, which usually forms like an internal box in a house. But they were concerned with it being a listed building that the insulation was actually attached to the brickwork on the outside, which sometimes they do on houses because it's a more efficient way of insulating them. So that was they were concerned that the historic fabric was damaged that way.
So, I think the client initially sort of played on the fact that, unfortunately the family member was deceased, and it was obviously quite a sensitive situation, and the works had been done, 3 decades prior. So it was very much a case of what's the alternative other than getting consent. We did a site visit, and again, as I say, it was one of the most beautifully converted properties, no expense spared, everything done to the letter in terms of the guidance we would have given them. And luckily there was a little vent in the bottom corner next to the fireplace that we were able to unscrew and take a look, and all of the walling, it was all cavity walling. So we could clearly see that none of the insulation was touching on the brickwork. It was all attached to the plasterboard. They'd even put in ventilation slits to allow airflow into the property and to keep the brickwork from getting damp and getting condensation and things like that. So again, a really, really good example. But when you find a sort of smoking gun like that, it's really exciting. And I remember I called Natalie on the way back on the drive and just said, look, I found this picture.
We're going to be fine. They're going to get it through. So yeah.
Yeah.
It was a really, I think the owners were really happy as well. It was obviously a really difficult time. Their family member just passed away. And then they had the council giving them hassle, or felt like they were giving them unnecessarily hassle, which was... so we were really happy to get that sorted for them.
It's always nice when you see people who have done something with a lot of care and a lot of, yes, okay, it was done without permission, but the issue of curtilage listing is such a grey area anyway, that it was the actual fact that they didn't realise that it was even part of the listing. So it was all done innocently, and as I said, it was done extremely well. So we're still waiting on the decision for that one, but I am very confident that that's going to go through. A slightly more controversial example is a project that we've been working on in the North Pennines. This is an historic farmstead. It used to be a bank barn.
Yeah, it was they're typical. They're usually seen in Cumbria and the northwest. They're like barns and farmsteads that are usually one long arrangement, and they're actually built into the bank using the earth as like natural insulation. Obviously it has its own problems being built into a bank site. It's very damp and a bit smelly, but yeah, that's historically they're usually seen around Cumbria, and they're really great.
We're very pro bank barn. No, cut that out. Okay. In this particular scheme, it is a mix of what we talked about before, where the client both inherited some works from the previous owner that they had done before they purchased it, and they also undertook some works themselves. Initially, there was an enforcement notice that was served, and we got brought on board to help out with this particular project. And as we kind of investigated the job and we looked into what had actually been done, there were a lot of things to get regularized. So in the first instance, similar to the previous job, it was an illegal conversion of a detached barn that was curtilage listed to the farmhouse, and that had been done by the previous owner about 10 years ago. So we had to get that brought above board, and then it came to pass that there were a couple of other bits and bobs, like some new windows, there was a new doorway entry, there were some roof lights and things like that the current owner had put in. So it was a bit of a two-pronged approach. It was, this wasn't done by our client, but this was, can we get both of it sorted, please? And at first, and naturally, I think the client was a bit hesitant about being open with us about the extent of the works that had been done. I think it's a bit like being scared of an authority figure, like we were going to report them
You
somehow.
don't have to admit you've done anything wrong.
Yeah. It's natural to get quite defensive, I think. But
a lot of the time, the mistakes were completely innocent as well.
yeah.
So they have nothing to, they could just say, look, I didn't realise, I'm sorry, can you help me?
Exactly. It's, being upfront is, as we've said before, the thing that's going to get things through. So eventually, I think once we built that sort of level of trust and we'd been to the property a few times, it was quite useful to then be able to put on paper everything that needed to get sorted. And it meant that we were in a position to be able to create the best possible argument, because if we're not working with all the facts, then we can't really help. So yes, it's very important to be honest with your heritage consultant. Please, we're not out to get you. We're here to help. So given the complexity of this particular case and the fact that the council, because a lot of the works were done by the current owner, there was a lot of
friction.
Yes, frostiness.
There was, yeah.
Between the applicant and the council. And we've kind of stepped in to be a bit of a buffer for both, because, our role is it's built to be objective. And whilst we represent the client, we're also there to protect the building and the heritage. So we're kind of this really convenient middle ground. We're this really convenient middleman where we can sort of see both sides, and we're not judging the client. We're just sort of telling them, this is where you went wrong. This is how to do it in the future. This is what we need to do to regularize it. But on the flip side, we also get where the council's coming from, because they're just trying to make sure everything's done legally, and they've got to put the hammer down sometimes. And it's about trying to make sure that the hammer is as gentle as possible.
I think sometimes they might be tempted to get a little carried away. It's not something that they will undertake a lot. So when they find an instance where they think, oh wow, this is really bad conversion, they've not done any, not got any planning permission, they've not been cooperative at all, that I think instantly that puts a guard up to them, and they will be very resistant to any future attempts to try and do right with that case, and they will flag your name up as well. And if you want to sell your house, or you want to seek for additional planning permission 10 years down the line, they'll remember your name, or it will come back to haunt you.
Yeah, and it's it can seem a little bit unfair as well when that happens, but I think this is where the role of a heritage consultant really comes into its own, because again, we're acting as that buffer between yourself and the conservation officer, or someone else at the council, potentially the enforcement team, and just trying to show that you're taking it very seriously. You've engaged a professional to come in and try and get everything sorted, but also somebody that is going to be willing to work with the council as well. And as Natalie was saying, it's so important to have a good relationship with your local authority, because if you want to do future works and they've blacklisted you, or they're not supposed to, but
they'll all remember human. Your name.
We're all human. I'm sure there's a few clients we sort of get a bit nervous when we see an email pop through, so everyone does it. So it's just really important that everyone is honest with each other, and that we communicate your position as best as possible to the council, just to make sure that you can get the consent through and be able to sell your property or live in it knowing that there's nothing outstanding, and you're not going to suddenly get a letter through the post telling you've got to remove your extension or your pergola at the back. We also do a lot of work with estate agents. So in this particular case of retrospective consent, our client is an elderly woman who she received a letter from the council saying that she had 28 days to remove some fencing, I think it was, and there was a little small glass conservatory at the back. Now, this has been put in by her husband, who again sadly passed away, and it was done about 5 or 6 years ago. So it does create a bit of a tricky case, because there's the fact that this woman who lives on her own is suddenly receiving what effectively is seen as quite an aggressive threat from the council.
It'd be quite scary, yeah.
Yeah.
Big red writing.
It's like the TV license letters,
Oh, don't.
Somebody's coming to look at your house, and, I bin them these days, but it's...
But listen, don't admit on a podcast that you don't
Oh my
pay
God.
for your TV license. I pay for everything that I need to.
I pay.
Absolutely.
I 100%
Disclosed.
pay for the BBC. So we can imagine this is obviously quite a stressful thing for our client. It was actually her children that got in touch with us via their estate agent, because obviously they can't sell the property until this has been regularised. And again, having the council sort of come at them and say, look, this needs to be done within 28 days or else you're going to be getting this fine. Again, obviously after a family member has passed away, it's devastating, really. So I think a lot of the time the human element can be lost in the bureaucracy of planning, and they sort of forget how best to approach things. So we've kind of stepped in a bit to find out the extent of the work, again, when it happened, how it was done, how has it potentially impacted the listed building. And our plan is then obviously to try and make sure that either they have more time to reverse it if necessary, or if we come to the conclusion that actually it doesn't need to be reversed and it doesn't have a negative impact, or it has a neutral impact, for example, then hopefully we can just get it all above board and the client will be able to sell her house and move on and kind of live out the rest of her life in peace, knowing that it's all been sorted. We're still working on this particular one, and again, it really comes down to how willing the council are to negotiate as well and work with us, given the kind of sensitive circumstances on this one. Again, it is unfortunate that a lot of these things come to light when the person responsible for doing the works has sadly either passed away or they've moved to a completely different country, and you can't really ask them what kind of plaster they used or what kind of mortar did they use. So it can be a little bit tricky, but that's where, again, having someone on board to kind of be that buffer between yourself and the council can be really useful.
And again, heritage consultants we're not just about helping with planning and advising on heritage law. You know, we are archaeologists as well, so a lot of the time if you don't know what's happened to your listed building, we can come in and be like, we can see the phasing in it, we read the bricks, we know the history, and because we see a lot of examples of things that happen and in local areas, so we can kind of put together a short history of what we think's happened to the building, if you can't.
Yes, exactly. It's something that it's not immediately obvious to a lot of people, or, you know, most people aren't going to be looking at the stonework trying to figure out when was this particular bit put in, or did this used to be a door or window. And again, it's very possible that works have been done decades before and they just didn't have permission. And now with the advent of, you know, social media and people taking pictures and posting them online, local councils have the ability to sort of keep tabs on this a lot more easily. I think a lot of people who
Google
have
Earth.
Yeah, Google Earth.
Yeah.
People who have remote properties might think, ooh, you know, I'll get away with this because nobody's ever going to drive down by my house. And then someone posts a picture on Instagram.
Or your neighbour, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. That's usually the case.
Lovely neighbours.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to have the neighbours of some of our clients, I have to say. They're not the friendliest. But, you know, it's just interesting to see how it's becoming a much bigger problem than I think it was, you know, 5-10 years ago, even 3 years ago. Like, it's definitely becoming a bigger problem. And again, I think that's down to the fact that people had a lot of time at home during COVID and decided to knock down a wall here and there, thinking nobody would ever know. But we're here to tell you they will know. Someone will know.
I think it's hard because a lot of people don't understand that, because it does sound a ridiculous concept, someone that's outside of the world of heritage and archaeology, that, oh, why is drilling a hole through this wall, why is this ruining my building? It's not ruining a building, it's taking away some of the historic fabric. And it's, where do we draw a line? Because if we keep allowing people to do that, what history is going to be left? You know, that's kind of why the protections are there. They're not just to be a pain.
Yeah.
Even though they seem like it.
They're not out to get you, and it's not, you know, I think there's this idea that it's all very nitty gritty, and planning is quite bureaucratic anyway, but it would help as well, I think, if there was a faster turnaround on these things, because nobody wants to be waiting 6 to 8 weeks to decide whether they can put in, you know, attach a satellite dish to their house. Does anyone even use satellite dishes anymore? Is that even a thing?
Probably not.
Probably not.
I don't know. I just use streaming services.
I do streaming as well. But for those of you who do have satellite dishes, it might seem a bit silly that you can't just put it on, and you've got to wait 8 weeks to do something. But a lot of the time we found that if you just get in touch with the conservation officer directly, even an email from them giving you permission to do something as minor as that can sometimes be enough. So, if you're trying to do new insulation works, for example, and you need to cut through the wall just to have a look, like an investigative.
Well, an example, like at the moment I'm being very fortunate to be able to buy my first house, and there's stuff that we want to do to it before we can move in. So we will, you'll want to seek planning permission sooner. It would be great if they could get round to it. So, like, for example, in our case, we need to replace some of the lead piping in the house. Don't know if we're going to be able to get that sorted before we move in. We would like to, because I don't want to be drinking water that's gone through lead pipes. But, it is a bit of give and take. I think they should be quicker on these applications so people can get essential works done to their house.
Yes, and it's important to say that things like emergency repairs, so for example, if in the sort of inclement weather we've been having with the high winds, if your slates start coming off, then obviously putting something in place to protect the building, that doesn't necessarily require, you don't have to wait 6 to 8 weeks to get that work done. So those would be things that are emergency repair works to the property. And again, it's sort of, where do you draw the line between what is classed as an emergency? Because, I've genuinely had clients come up and say, oh, well, we really needed a roof light there. It was an emergency. And that's obviously not going to fly with the council. So it's just about using common sense a bit as well. But ultimately, as we said before in our previous episode, they definitely do want to work with you rather than against you.
So kind of just to summarise on what we've been talking about, retrospective planning isn't the big scary thing that a lot of people think it is. If you get the big red letter through the post, don't worry. It's something that can be sorted out. Obviously, you can sort it out yourself if you've got the knowledge, you know exactly what's happened, you know how to approach this. But it's usually generally on more complex schemes, bigger ones, or ones that have a lot of heritage assets involved, or in a conservation area, for example. It's usually best to get an expert on board. Obviously, be careful where you get your experts from. Yeah, make sure that all experts are CFRO accredited, have the relevant archaeology background. I would say archaeology is essential.
Yes, we're a bit biased though.
Yeah. But yeah.
Not all consultants come from an archaeological background. There's a lot of amazing ones that come from a planning background or a sort of a history background. But because we're both archaeologists, we're a little bit biased.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for the second episode of Heritage Happy Hour.
Stay tuned next time. What are we talking about next time?
We'll see you next time. I don't know. What are we talking about next time? We hope you liked today's episode. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to our podcast or leave us a review. You can listen to us now on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.